Hey guys, welcome to a journey back in time, to a world without electricity, without modern comfort, and without mercy. In today's video, we've combined the most shocking, fascinating, and brutal truths from across multiple historical sources to reveal what life was truly like during the Middle Ages. From the worst jobs ever imagined, to how people actually slept, worked, and struggled to stay alive. This isn't fantasy, this is real medieval life, so stay tuned and ask yourself once more, could you survive even a single week in the Dark Ages? Life in the city walls. Many Roman walls still visible today throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Be they defensive walls such as the Servian Wall or house and monument walls, tell us a great deal about the evolution of Roman construction techniques. Roman walls went from dry stone and sun-dried bricks walls at the beginning of Roman civilization to walls built with a concrete core and brick facing by the beginning of the empire. These walls also provide many clues to the history of ancient Rome and the different stages of the Roman economy and society. Early Roman WALS stone walls. The earliest Roman walls were dry stone walls constructed by placing stones of various sizes, one upon the other, without the use of any kind of mortar to bind the stones together. These walls are sometimes called Cyclopean, in reference to the Greek mythology giants called Cyclopes, who were considered the only ones capable of lifting stones of such enormous weight. Developments in stone cutting techniques led to construction using stones of the more similar size and form, and by the 6th century BCE, the Romans had developed a wall construction method which increased the wall's strength, called opus quadratum, described by Latin author Vitruvius in De Architectura. Blocks of stone of the same height were set in parallel courses, without mortar alternating. On the face of the wall, the longer and the shorter side of the stone block, Romans used blocks of limestone or tuff, which was abundant in Rome and its surroundings. For example, in quarries such as Grotta Oscura, noting that tuff is a type of rock made of volcanic ash, which is relatively soft and therefore easy to cut. Brick walls before the invention of concrete. House walls were built with stones or sun-dried mud brick. Sun-dried mud brick or adobe has been used throughout the world for thousands of years. It is durable in dry climates and is known to have excellent thermal insulation properties. Adobe is made by mixing earth sand, silt and clay with water and an organic material such as straw or dung and cut into small units so that it can dry quickly without cracking, in order to ensure that walls did not crack. Sokals made of stone or rubble about 35 centimeters, 14 inches, wide for single-store houses and wider for two-story houses, were laid as foundations on the ground. Sun-dried mud bricks were then placed and bonded together with mud. Walls during the Republic and EMPRE concrete revolution by the late 3rd century BCE. The Romans revolutionized construction with the invention of concrete. Concrete was developed by experimenting with a type of mortared rubble construction called opus cementitium. It was made by adding a volcanic dust called pozzolana to mortar made of a mixture of brick or rock pieces, lime or gypsum, and water. Pozzolana, which contained both silica and alumina, created a chemical reaction which dramatically strengthened the cohesiveness of the mortar. Modern concrete is about 10 times stronger than Roman concrete, but the pozzolana contained in opus cementitium made Roman concrete more durable against the elements. For example, recent research by US and Italian scientists has shown that Roman harbors in the Mediterranean made of Roman concrete have remained intact after 2,000 years of constant pounding by the sea, while the concrete of modern harbors begins to erode. After only 50 years of exposure to seawater, with the opus cementaceme discovery. The Romans started building walls made of concrete at a much faster pace than with cut stone constructions. Walls had an inner core which consisted of commenta fist-sized stones laid in abundant mortar and a facing with stone or brick, which also made walls more pleasant to look at. The facing and the core of the wall were laid and rose together as a single unit, with two masons working on opposite sides. There were many types of facings. Opus incertum, introduced around the late 3rd century BCE, was a facing which consisted of small blocks of stone placed in a random pattern. Opus reticulatum was introduced by the late 2nd century BCE and was a more regularized facing, eventually consisting of square or pyramid-shaped blocks of tuff set in a diagonal grid pattern. Many scholars believe that opus reticulatum was a more efficient way of constructing walls and required labor that was less skilled, as tasks could easily be divided. The appearance of the opus reticulatum technique also coincides with the increase in the supply of slave labor. During the 1st century CE, the use of the opus testaceum wall construction technique superseded opus reticulatum. Opus testaceum was a brick-faced concrete rather than tuff or other stones. In the middle of the 1st century CE, most walls were predominantly faced with small bricks of a triangular shape. One reason for the development of brick facing was the development of the brick industry and the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE under Nero, which led to the building of fireproof structures. Opus mixtum is another type of opus reticulatum and was a technique which became common in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. In the opus mixtum technique, panels of reticulatum were separated by bands of brick facing. It is believed that this technique saved on manpower and on bricks, which were relatively expensive at the time. The resulting strip design can be seen in many buildings of the late Empire and on the walls of Constantinople. The strip design was also commonly used in the later Byzantine Empire and even influenced the design of medieval cathedrals, such as the Orvieto Cathedral in Italy. The introduction of fired clay. Bricks and dried mud bricks were much weaker than fired clay bricks and could only be used for smaller constructions. As a result, stones or stone reinforcements were required for larger constructions that had no concrete in them. It is only starting from the reign of Augustus to 7 BCE, 14 CE, that techniques invented by the Greeks were widely adopted to make fired clay bricks. Fire clay bricks were made from clay. Clay had to be extracted from deposits, ground, mixed with water, and shaped in the form of bricks. These bricks were dried and then fired in a chamber at temperatures of around 1000 C. The clay bricks, initially green, took a red-brown color as the iron minerals naturally contained in the clay became oxidized. The Romans developed brick-making techniques, and bricks became the primary building material in the 1st century CE for the walls of houses, Roman baths, and monuments. Bricks were mostly used as a facing for concrete walls in Italy, whereas in the provinces they could be used as the wall's main structural material, with bands of bricks extending the full thickness of the wall. Contrary to popular belief, marble was not common in Rome. It was actually not found anywhere close to Rome, and therefore was rarely used until the reign of Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, who famously said, "I found Rome a city of bricks, and left it a city of marble." Even during the time of Augustus, though, marble was only used as a facing for the walls of a few monuments, such as the Temple of Venus and the Basilica Julia. Roman bricks were longer and of a lesser height than modern bricks, and made in a variety of shapes and sizes: square, rectangular, triangular, round, with the longest bricks measuring over 90 centimeters, 3 feet in length. The most common brick size was 1.5 Roman feet by 1 foot. 1 Roman foot equals 0.97 modern foot, or c. 30 centimeters. Roman legions, who stamped bricks with their mark, also spread Rome's brickmaking know-how throughout the empire. By the early 2nd century CE, brick stamps included the name of the consuls for the year of production, thereby making it easier for archaeologists to date a specific construction. Defensive. WALS, Servian wall. The Romans built massive walls to defend their cities and sometimes their military camps. The method with which these walls were built changed as construction methods evolved. Initially, walls were built using tightly fitting massive irregular stone blocks, similar to the walls built by the Mycenaeans. One of the first important defensive walls was the Servian wall, 11 kilometers or 7 miles long, named after the Roman king Servius Tullius and built around the 6th century BCE. The wall was 3.6 meters, 12 feet, thick at its base and up to 10 meters, 32.8 feet high. It was improved following the sack of Rome by the Gauls in the 4th century BCE and proved very effective against Hannibal's army during the Second Punic War. It was built using large blocks of tough, easily available near Rome, placed one upon the other using the opus quadratum technique. Some sections of the wall had a deep ditch to render it taller, and other sections had ramps of earth along the inside of the wall to make it thicker and serve as a base for Roman soldiers. By the beginning of the empire, Rome had grown outside of the Servian wall's perimeter, and the wall was gradually removed during the first 3 centuries of the empire as Rome's territory and military strength grew. It is only during the Germanic invasions of the 3rd century CE that Emperor Aurelian built the 19 kilometers, 12 miles long Aurelian walls around Rome, which encompassed a larger area than the previous Servian walls. They had a tower every 30 meters, 97 feet or so, and by the 6th century CE they possessed 383 towers, 18 main gates, and were outfitted with an array of sophisticated defensive weapons, including catapults. Frontier walls. Rome had only a few walls defending its borders. Hadrian's Wall was built from 122 to 128 CE on the Pictish frontier to protect the borders of the Roman province of Britannia. It was constructed using only local materials, not concrete, which required large quantities of water, and not bricks, which could not be locally produced in massive quantities. The wall had a core of earth or clay with stones and was faced with large stones in a soft mortar. It was 117.5 kilometers, 73 miles long. It was from 3 meters, 9.8 feet to 6 meters, 20 feet thick and up to 6 meters high. The wall had a fort every 5 Roman miles, 7.5 km or 4.7 miles, comprising garrisons of infantry and cavalry. The Antonine Wall was built from 142 to 154 CE, further north of the Hadrian Wall, mainly to protect the border from the Caledonians. It was approximately 63 kilometers, 39 miles long, 5 meters, 16 feet wide, and 3 meters, 10 feet high. The wall had stone foundations, but it was built out of turf and not out of stone, which is the reason why it is barely visible today. It was abandoned only 8 years after completion due to its limited effectiveness. Conclusiones. Construction techniques evolved, so did the methods to construct walls. Wall construction in ancient Rome was also influenced by external factors, such as the availability of construction materials and the easy supply of slave labor or manpower, such as in the case of many defensive walls were built by Roman soldiers, be they defensive walls or walls for buildings or monuments. The large number of ancient Roman walls still standing today offer us ample information on the history of ancient Rome and convincing evidence of their durability. The worst jobs in history thinks your job is bad. At least you're not a gong farmer, forced to dig through human waste for a living. Welcome to the dark side of medieval employment. Want to know what kind of jobs there were in the Middle Ages? A unique source from the 15th century gives us some beautiful images of medieval people at work, known as the house books of the Nuremberg 12 Brothers Foundation. These were records of a charitable foundation started in the German city of Nuremberg in 1388. The foundation would assist poor and needy people by providing them with training to work in a trade. Starting around 1425, their books would contain one-page illustrations of the people they had helped, usually giving their names and a short description of when they lived and what they were doing. Here are 40 examples of medieval jobs from the 15th and early 16th centuries. Hans Lengenfelder is cutting meat on a thick table, while other products, including sausages, are for sale. Butchers would be needed to prepare meat for many customers, but their profession was one that created a lot of smell and waste, leading towns to regulate where they could practice this trade. Zena is placing bread to be baked in an oven. Bakers were often heavily regulated in the Middle Ages, with authorities making sure their products could even be bought by the poorest people. Conrad is using a pickaxe and other tools to work over the stone blocks. Stonemasons would prepare the materials for construction, whether it be houses, walls, or churches. Hans is working on a loom. The making of clothing required several professions during the Middle Ages, such as the weaving of thread into cloth, that Hans is using a sickle to cut the grapes from the vine. This specialized type of farming was needed to produce wine. Fritz Richtel is pulling up a net with 3 fish, while 2 more traps hang from a pole. Fishermen in the Middle Ages often used traps and nets that were placed in rivers or lakes, while others used boats to sail out into the ocean. See also Reinhold is using a 2-handed plough in his fields. Most medieval people would be employed on farms. They could also do farming in cities. Sapatar is standing in a bell tower and blows the hourly chime, employed by city officials. Trumpet players would be used to help deliver messages and signal the time. Peter Vellner sits in his workshop, working on a shoe with a curved knife. Other leather shoes are on display, sometimes also known as cordwainers. They would make much needed footwear for people. Thomas Wagner is using a hatchet to work a spoked wheel lying on a wooden frame. Wagons and carts would often see their wheels get damaged and need replacing. Fritz is standing on a ladder and placing tiles on the roof with the use of a bucket of mortar and a trowel. This would be one of the trades involved in building a house or other structured. Albrecht is sitting by his iron anvil with a hammer and a padlock. Doors and chests would often be protected by locks in the Middle Ages. Peter is stepping into a tub to work on an animal's skin. The process of turning an animal hide into leather involved having the skin deharred, degreased, desalted, and soaked in water. It was an occupation that would be regulated by towns because of the smell and waste it created. This unnamed man is at a gatehouse and taking payment from a merchant. Governments needed to collect money and employed people to do so, as one might expect. This profession was not looked upon kindly by the people who had to pay taxes. Hermann Paumgartner is using a hacksaw and anvil to punch holes in the belts. This was another type of specialized clothing maker. Berthold Uslomby is selling spices from a table he set up on a barrel. He holds a pair of scales in his hands to weigh the product. In the Middle Ages, Merchants often focused on selling a particular range of products, like spices, foods, or second-hand goods. Hans Perniker is polishing various pieces of armor, while other tools of his trade are spread around his workshop. This profession would need to have specialized knowledge to make the equipment used by knights and soldiers. Rudolf Meyer has finished the framework for a house. You can see some of his tools. Carpenters would work with wood to create a range of items, from the small to the large. Wilhelm is standing in a kitchen, cooking food on a fire. There are spoons and jars around him, and a pot hanging from the ceiling. Cooks could find employment with wealthier households. Fritz Hufschmied is hammering a red-hot horseshoe on the anvil. Blacksmiths would commonly be found in smaller villages, where they made nails, horseshoes, and other everyday metal goods. See Alsokanzlern has 4 keys, wear wooden shoes, known as clogs, and sweeps the floor with a broom. Servants could often be found in wealthy and even middle-class households, with young people often getting the work in exchange for room and board. To learn more, please see Hans Verber works over a long blue cloth with his instruments too rough up the garment. Another part of the clothing making process, the dyer would be responsible for adding color to the textiles. Staff, Staffelstein. The goldsmith is using a hammer to work a conical cup on the anvil. Goldsmiths would create higher-end products like jewelry, usually for the wealthy Ulrich Gotch-Sigurd, with his selection of hats. Like today, in the Middle Ages, one could find a wide range of headwear. Ulrich, the tailor, works at a table, cutting a piece of green fabric with a pair of scissors. The tailor would be the final stage in preparing clothing for people, often creating outfits that were customized for the buyer. See also, Konrad Kellner rides a bridled white horse with a lance on his shoulder, an iron helmet, and spurred boots. It was not difficult for men to find employment serving in an army, and many made their careers as mercenaries. Konrad Eschenloher is using a hammer and anvil to make a bottle. For finished bottles hang above the rail in the display window. On the shelf below there is a jug with a handle, a bottle without a holder, and another jug with a curved bottom. One can also see large sheets of sheet metal. Tinsmiths differed from blacksmiths in that they worked with tin or other light metals that did not need to be heated to be worked on. Hans Pointline has his 2 horses pulling a single axle cart which is carrying a large block of stone. There was always a need in the Middle Ages for people to transport goods or people from place to place. Andreas Sporer is creating a spur while several others are on display. This would be a very specialized profession, creating spurs that people would use while riding horses. Paul is wearing camouflage and wields a long clamp trap to catch birds. Hunting wild animals for food would be another common practice in the medieval world. Ulrich Holzhacker is using an axe to break apart wood, while a neat pile can be seen in the background, since there would be many uses for wood in medieval communities. It would be common to employ people in cutting down trees and preparing the logs for trade. Nicholas Kerner is sitting on a stool with a palette in his hand, and is painting a picture of Mary with the baby Jesus. While one might think that paintings were made just for upper-class people, there were also painters who could produce affordable pieces of work. Nussel Weinschenk fills a jug with wine from a cask. The hanging sign above the cask might be there to indicate the origins of the wine. Every medieval town or city would have inns and taverns to accommodate visitors, or be a place for local people to find food and entertainment. Jens Krag stands in the doorway of a church, pulling the rope attached to the bell. Each church would need several people to maintain and run the building, including the sacristan. Ulrich Schwab sits behind his workbench, working with an awl on a collar to be used on a draft animal. Some of his other products can also be seen. A saddler would prepare items to be worn by horses and oxen as they worked in the fields or were ridden by people. Kuhn CZ Steirener is dressed in a cloak and hat, and carries a lance on his shoulder and a small shield bearing the coat of arms for Nuremberg. The sending of information, whether it be between government or city officials, merchants or churchmen, helped to employ many people who would travel and deliver messages. See also Otto Makar operates the two wheels with the hooks, where he can twist individual threads into a cord. A finished ball of yarn hangs in the display window. The making of rope was another specialized craft, creating something that people needed at least occasionally. Hans Pfaffenhofer uses pliers to pull a nail out of the horse's hoof. A farrier would be someone who took care of horses' hooves, in particular the putting on of horseshoes for the animals. Erhard Leder is sifting flour while bags of flour are ready for use. To turn grain into flour for baking, one would need a miller's assistance. A water or windmill could make this process easier, but a miller could also do this work by hand. The Nuremberg 12 Brothers Foundation continued this practice into the 19th century, giving us almost 1,200 illustrations of people in their various crafts and jobs. You can see the entire manuscript at this. How dirty was medieval life? Forget about daily showers. In the Middle Ages, water was feared more than disease. So how did people stay clean? The truth is, they didn't. Historic people bathed, too. There is nothing like a good hot soak in a bath or a bracing shower. Putting on clean clothes and generally giving ourselves a mini makeover lifts our confidence and mood. More importantly, we smell better. However, traveling back in time, we might be shocked at some of the unhygienic practices that were carried out, or not carried out, as the case may be. Having said this, it's a myth that people in the past never took baths. Most rich people did, using a large barrel-shaped construction for bathing in hot water. In the 13th century, there were also public baths. The water was heated from the log fires nearby and carried by servants to the tub. However, the downside was that many of these buildings caught fire and usually took down a number of other structures before the fire died out. Additionally, when firewood became more scarce due to the decimation of forests, it was expensive to have a bath. Whole families and groups of friends shared the water, or many had to remain dirty. Poor people bathed in cold water, but for obvious reasons, they probably washed less frequently. They would use water where it was convenient to do so, a river, a lake, or by carrying water to the home. Additionally, most large houses and castles had areas for washing hands both before and after a meal. Nevertheless, in other areas of life, hygiene was practically non-existent, mainly due to ignorance of bacteria, viruses, and the principles of cross-infection. However, traveling back in time, we might be shocked at some of the unhygienic practices that were carried out, or not carried out, as the case may be. Having said this, it's a myth that people in the past never took baths. Most rich people did, using a large barrel-shaped construction for bathing in hot water. In the 13th century, there were also public baths. The water was heated from the log fires nearby and carried by servants to the tub. However, the downside was that many of these buildings caught fire and usually took down a number of other structures before the fire died out. Additionally, when firewood became more scarce due to the decimation of forests, It was expensive to have a bath. Whole families and groups of friends shared the water, or many had to remain dirty. Poor people bathed in cold water, but for obvious reasons, they probably washed less frequently. They would use water where it was convenient to do so, a river, a lake, or by carrying water to the home. Additionally, most large houses and castles had areas for washing hands both before and after a meal. Nevertheless, in other areas of life, hygiene was practically non-existent, mainly due to ignorance of bacteria, viruses, and the principles of cross-infection. Guard, loo, and other toilet habits. The romantic scene of a towering castle surrounded by the pristine sparkling waters of a moat is not strictly true, especially when we talk about toilets from hundreds of years ago. In Tudor houses, they were called privies. Many were basically a bowl with a slab of wood and a hole carved in the top. This would be set into a recess or cupboard-like area called a garderobe. The castles were not much better. The slab of wood often just covered a hole in the floor that took waste products straight into the moat. Now you know why there are no picturesque paintings of some cute rustic fishing in a castle moat. Peasants did not have the luxury of any form of toilet, no matter how crude. They were forced to relieve themselves where they could and then bury any waste matter. Washing your hands after doing your business was not practiced by anyone, of course. Rich or poor, neither had toilet paper. Poor people would use leaves or moss to wipe their bottoms. If you had a bit more money, then you would use lamb's wool. However, if you were the king, then you employed someone to wipe your bottom for you. The position of royal bum wiper was officially called the groom of the stool. The more formal title would be read as groom of the king's close stool to king name. As disgusting as this job may seem to be, it was a much sought-after position. Noblemen would fight hard and dirty, excuse the pun, to get their sons employed in this role, as it often resulted in, eventually, advancing to powerful roles, such as private secretary to the king. The reason for the promotion was that the groom, who knew the king's most intimate secrets, often became his most trusted advisor and friend. If you ever find yourself transported back in time to old Edinburgh, be prepared for the shout of Gardloo. If you were not quick enough, or if you were disliked, you could find yourself being showered with the contents of chamber pots hurled from the tenement windows. Chamber pots were of course used to collect urine overnight. The term Gardloo comes from the French garde-lou, which means watch out for the water. This is where the nickname loo for the toilet may have come from. The resulting stench of chamber pot contents was ironically known as the flowers of Edinburgh. So what happened to all this waste littering the streets? There was, in theory, supposed to be some form of street cleaning, but this was seldom carried out effectively. The streets all year round were covered in feces, human and animal urine, rotting food, corpses of animals, and so on. It wasn't until the end of the 18th century that an effective street cleaning regime came into force. Personal grooming and hygiene royalty. King James VI of Scotland, I of England, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, was called the wisest fool in Christendom. Unfortunately, this wisdom didn't include personal hygiene. The king wore the same clothes for months on end, even sleeping in them on occasion. He also kept the same hat on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until it basically fell apart. He point-blank refused to wash or bath as he was convinced it was bad for your health. Beasts and nasty things. Medieval times, and later one major source of infection was bites from fleas and body lice. They were rife. The poorer people, in particular, were very susceptible. Due to a meager diet and malnutrition, the sores from bites would often become infected. In addition, The human flea is capable of spreading diseases such as typhus and parasites such as tapeworms. Another source for infection, especially in medieval times, was the use of rushes straw on the floors. They were used to cover up the natural dirt floor of the building, and the top rushes were often changed. Added to these would be sweet-smelling wildflowers and herbs to fragrance the room. However, often the bottom layer of rushes was not completely cleared, and this led to all manner of possible infection sources. The great scholar Erasmus visited Britain in the 16th century and made this statement: "The rushes were particularly prone to dirt and filth in the eating halls within manor houses or castles. Various foodstuffs, drinks, and other deposits were frequently thrown or spilled onto the floors and left. Many of the household dogs would eat up the majority of the food, but even they left enough to encourage rodents and bacteria to flourish." Samuel Pepys was not only one of the most humorous of diarists, but there was no subject that he would not write about. The following are extracts about life that give some wonderful insights into the way people lived hundreds of years ago. 10 weird facts about grooming in the past. Eyebrows that did not look fashionable were often masked by tiny pieces of skin from a mouse. Ceruse was the foundation makeup of choice for both men and women that gave the famous, smooth, pale look. However, it contained lead that seeped into the body through the skin, leading to poisoning. This makeup also tended to crack and had a strong odor. Although the men wore linen drawers, the women wore no knickers at all. The reason why so many marriages took place in June was that most people had their yearly bath in May, so they were still fairly clean when June arrived. However, as a precaution, brides carried bouquets of flowers to cover up any odious smells. June weddings and carrying bouquets are still traditional today, but most wedding parties smell a lot nicer. When people took their bath, it was the man of the house who had the privilege of the tub filled with clean water. The sons of the house were allowed next, then the wife. The rest of the females and the babies were last. Houses in the past did not have the protective roofing we have today. It was not unusual for bugs, pests, and droppings to fall onto your clean bedding from the roof. So 4 poles and a canopy was invented to keep the bed clean, and this is where the origin of the canopied and 4-poster beds come from. A 17th century publication by Peter Levens gives clear instructions to men on how to cure baldness and thinning hair by making the following mixture: a strong alkaline solution containing potassium salts and chicken droppings to be placed on the area to be treated. In addition, if men wanted to remove unwanted hair from any area of the body, they should make a paste that contains eggs, strong vinegar, and cat dung. Once beaten into a paste, this should be placed on the areas where the hair is to be removed. Why they didn't just shave is not documented. When Mary Queen of Scots returned to her native Scotland from France, she was astounded and not a little put out that the men continued to wear their hats while sitting down to eat at her banquets. It was then pointed out to the young queen that this was not a sign of disrespect to her, but necessity. The men kept their hats on in order to prevent not only their long hair from touching the food, but head lice from falling into their plates. In the 16th century, some members of the church condemned using forks to eat as against the will of God. One put-out minister remarked, "God would not have given us fingers if he had wanted us to use forks." The use of condoms goes back many thousands of years. They went out of favor after the decline of the Roman Empire, but re-emerged in the form of linen condoms in the 16th century, perhaps due to the fear of the disease syphilis. The church condemned condoms as a way for the devil to encourage illicit sex. One incensed churchman raged that the use of these foul things allows people to play filthy persons greater than ever. Cesspits and water. In the good old days, there was no such thing as proper sewer drains. Most town and city streets had open sewers running down them, into which all kinds of waste was thrown. There was, in theory at least, a system of refuge collection to clean up the streets that were littered with rotting food, dung, animal corpses, human feces, and other waste products. But the cleaning up system was sporadic and not carried out effectively enough. In addition, people had to make do with burying much of their waste material in a cesspit, either in their cellar or in the garden. Technically, these were supposed to be emptied regularly, but many were not. The stench was overwhelming, not only in summer, but in winter as well. Waterith. You were fairly well off, then you could hire a water carrier to bring water to your home. The poorer folks had to collect their own either from a nearby river or public well. The super rich paid private water companies for their drinking and general water needs. But this didn't necessarily make the water any healthier or taste better. The main water supply was via elm trunks and domestic pipes, which were lead-lined. In addition, because the water supply only ran for a few hours at a time, it had to be stored in large lead tanks and often became stagnant. The famous diarist, Samuel Pepys, believed he caught a cold after washing his feet in water taken from a lead-lined tank. Laundry. When doing your laundry in the past, you didn't have the luxury of biological or non-biological soap powders nor sweet-smelling fabric conditioners. Your clothes, linen, etc. would have been scoured in lye, made up from ashes and human urine. The use of human urine to wash clothes and linen goes back to at least Roman times and was favored for its great ability to remove stains. The lakes and rivers, as they are today, were becoming increasingly polluted by people dropping waste into them. The amount of filth being dumped was reaching such a level that in the 14th century, just after the outbreak of the Black Death, the English Parliament made a declaration that clearly shows they are beginning to identify a link between disease and waste disposal. The 1388 declaration states, item, that so much dung and filth of the garbage and entrails be cast and put into ditches, rivers, and other waters, so that the air there is grown greatly corrupt and infected, and many maladies and other intolerable diseases do daily happen. It is accorded and assented that the proclamation be made as well in the city of London as in other cities, boroughs, and towns through the realm of England, where it shall be needful that all they who do cast and lay all such annoyances, dung, garbages, entrails, and other ordure, in ditches, rivers, waters, and other places aforesaid, shall cause them utterly to be removed, avoided, and carried away, every one upon pain to lose and forfeit to our Lord the King the sum of £20. It would be all too easy for us to gloat, ridicule, or laugh at our ancestors for their less than clean lifestyle. However, it should be remembered that many of their habits, or lack of them, was not due to laziness, but lack of understanding about the true nature of disease. In addition, they had a different set of priorities from us today. Death and disease was a daily battle for people in the past. It was not until the 20th century that we found the means to really begin the fight against dangerous infections. But this conflict continues even today. A number of our oldest disease adversaries are making a comeback. We may have, so far, won the battle against disease, but will we win the war? The fight continues. Sleeping in strange ways, beds shared by multiple people, sleeping upright, and waking up in the middle of the night was totally normal. Let's uncover how medieval people slept. The invention of the first coinage in ancient Lydia money may take many forms, From the digital code of cryptocurrency to the woodpecker scalps favored in early California, people have also used cattle, cacao beans, cowrie shells, chewing gum, grain, and giant stones as money. Early cultures became especially fond of metals, particularly silver, gold, and electrum, an alloy of the other two. These held their value, unlike a dead cow, were easy to transport, unlike a giant stone, and they could be measured out in exact amounts and fractions, unlike a woodpecker scalp. The only problem with metals is all the weighing. This adds time to every transaction, increasing the inconvenience and costs of doing business with bullion. There had to be a better way, and the ancient Lydians invented it. Lydians invent coinaging approximately 630 BCE. Someone in the Anatolian kingdom of Lydia stamped a piece of precious metal with something akin to a signet ring. One outcome of this simple act was that it increased confidence in the lump's weight and purity when later used in the marketplace. This procedure did nothing to modify the intrinsic value of the commodity, but it simplified the exchange of bullion for anyone willing to accept the stamp's guarantee. Prima facie, rather than reweighing and retesting the lump every time it was traded, merchants could set aside their cumbersome scales, weights, and touchstones to accelerate their transactions by counting out, not weighing out, this new form of currency. The Greeks, who quickly adopted this Lydian technology, named the coins numismata because they functioned as money by accepted convention nomos. That acceptance probably grew by degrees. The first time a fellow showed up in a Lydian marketplace with some stamped chunks of electrum, most of his neighbors may not have noticed or cared. The metal went into the balance pan with other bullion to pay a debt or purchase a lamb. Nothing differentiated the stamped and unstamped pieces until people could agree, by custom nomos, that the message punched into the metal had special meaning. At that point, the object obtained the three essential elements of a coin, as later stipulated by Isidore of Seville in the 7th century CE: acceptable metal, weight, and design. The stamps were rudimentary affairs at first, bearing messages, in Greek or Lydian, stating, "I am the signet of Phanes," or "I am the seal of Ceucas." It must be remembered, however, that ancient peoples treated a seal more formally than we do a signature. The seal embodied the full power and prestige of the person associated with it. We might compare this to a document that has been notarized and not merely signed. These legends accompanied diverse images ranging from a lion to a stag, all hammered into the metal by a hardened die. Persons such as Phanes and Ceucas, perhaps one a military commander and the other a king, stood surety for their stamped bullion in terms of its quality and quantity. Their prior involvement with the metal made it easier to transact business using it. To make this innovation even more convenient, coins were struck in 7 denominations going down to a minute fraction, 1/192 of a stater weighing less than 1/10 of a gram, 0.004 ounces. This fact suggests a high degree of coin-based monetization, accommodating payments large and small across the Lydian economy. State coinage and King Croesuswat may have begun as a series of private acts, assumed greater and greater public significance, until it became a state monopoly. Lydian rulers stamped more and more coins into existence. Just as importantly, they enforced compliance by virtue of their royal fiat. Experts often call these early royal coins crosids in honor of King Croesus, who governed Lydia from about 561 to 546 BCE. The innovation spread rapidly, probably abetted by the demands of Greek mercenaries for payment in money that could easily and quickly be spent or stored without losing its value. This explains why the Persians adopted coinage in those areas of their empire, where they recruited and stationed mercenary soldiers. Minting took hold more slowly in other regions of the Mediterranean, even those commercially active such as Egypt, Phoenicia, Carthage, and Etruria. The Romans did not issue a steady silver currency until the late 3rd century BCE. Commerce did not create coins, and coins did not create commerce. They simply worked together. Similarly, coins did not give rise to war, slavery, tyranny, or empire. Coinage simply did poetry, art, and history to take part. Messaging on coins. Ancients soon realized that the validating message pressed onto one side of a coin, the obverse, could be augmented by stamping an additional design on the other side as well, the reverse. This early step doubled the communicative power of coinage by placing outgoing messages on both faces. An analogy can be found in Mark Twain's classic tale, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where roving knights used their armor as multi-purpose billboards to spread public service messages near and far. That notion is doubly communicated on a US silver dollar showing one of Twain's knights on the reverse. Today, we might think, instead of modern delivery trucks that have their daily tasks to perform in the marketplace, as long as they are traveling about anyway, carrying milk or crews of plumbers, why not also employ them as mobile signs? Messaging on metal-made coins, something radically new history on the outside, with money in the middle. Once states took over responsibility for striking coins, they each experimented with this new medium. By and large, the Greeks placed the image of a patron deity, hero, animal, or mythological creature on their coins, such as Hercules, strangling a lion for the mintages of Heraclea, a city named in his honor. Significant regional products and folk tales might also be publicized, such as Sirenis, medicinal silphium plant, or Tarentum's eponymous hero, Taras, riding a dolphin. Coins might proudly carry the name of the issuing king or city, often abbreviated and sometimes with the initials or monogram of a local mint official. In rare cases, the artist who carved the dies signed his work, for instance, the talented UNA, responsible for the exquisite chariot racing coins of Sicily. Some famous designs gave their names to the coins themselves, such as the owls of Athens and archers of Achaemenid Persia. In much the same way as we speak today of Benjamins in America, loonies in Canada, and Kiwis in New Zealand, the 2nd century CE writer Plutarch still knew that everyone, even the Spartans, called Athenian coins owls back in the 5th century BC. Significantly, most Greek money was made more beautiful than it needed to be for commercial use. In modern parlance, it was creatively packaged to please the consumer and promote the product. It brought to markets all over the ancient world a steady display of artistic skills. Measured lumps of traded metal were transformed into miniature masterpieces. Each die was hand-carved, and every coin was hand-struck. Machine manufacturing of coinage would not arise until the 17th century. The high relief of ancient Greek coins, unlike the flatness characteristic of most modern money, gave them a remarkable sculptural quality that great artists could exploit, although easily stackable. Modern coins, with rare exceptions, do not stack up against their Greek forebears as three-dimensional art. The competitive spirit of the Greeks may be better known in its athletic, military, political, and architectural forms, but coin-making stands out as well for quality and messaging. For example, numerous cities vied for recognition as the birthplace of Homer by depicting the poet on their coins. Others sought to establish their connection to one of the Homeric heroes. The Macedonian town of Ania used its coins to illustrate The escape of Aeneas and his family from Troy. The design was later reprised on the propaganda coinage of Julius Caesar, who advertised his descent from the Trojan warrior Aeneas, son of Venus and Anchises, in order to ennoble his family's origins. The claim to fame of the small town of Maronia was that its eponymous hero, Marone, had supplied Odysseus with the wine that inebriated the dangerous Cyclops Polyphemus. So its citizens proudly displayed a grape cluster on their coinage. Food, famine, and fear. Meat was rare, vegetables were bland, and bread was often full of dust, or worse. Eating was an act of survival, not pleasure. Serfdom and daily life in the medieval world. Medieval serfs, aka villains, were unfree laborers who worked the land of a landowner or its tenant in return for physical and legal protection and the right to work a separate piece of land for their own basic needs, making up at least 75% of the medieval population. Serfs were not slaves, as only their labor could be bought, not their person, although they were subject to certain fees and restrictions of movement, which varied according to local custom. The hub of the medieval rural community and reason for a serf's existence was the manor or castle, the estate owner's private residence and place of communal gatherings for purposes of administration and legal matters. The relationship of the peasantry to these manors and their lords is known as serfdom. Declined by the 14th century CE, thanks to social and economic changes, particularly the wider use of coinage with which serfs could be paid, allowing some the possibility of eventually buying their own freedom. The idea of people of different social levels living together on a single estate for mutual benefit goes back to Roman times, when countryside villas produced foodstuffs on their surrounding land. As the Roman Empire declined and foreign raids and invasions became more common, the security of living together in a protected place had distinct advantages. The lord of an estate gave the right to live and work on his land to the peasantry in return for their labor service. Peasants were either free or unfree, with the latter category known as serfs or villeins. Serfdom evolved in part from the slavery system of the old Roman Empire. Without much property of their own, the serfs gave up their freedom of movement and their labor in exchange for the benefits of life on the estate of a landowner. In addition to those born into serfdom, many free laborers unwittingly became serfs because their own small plot of land was barely sufficient for their needs. In such circumstances as a prolonged illness or a bad harvest, many freemen became serfs in order to survive, a downgrading frequently attested to in 1087 CE's Doomsday Book, a record of landowners and labourers in Norman England. Country estates covered as little as a few hundred acres, which was just about enough land to meet the needs of those who lived on it. The smallest unit of land was called a manor. Manors could be owned by the monarch, aristocrats, or the church, and the very rich could own several hundred manors, collectively known as an honour. The majority of manors were like small villages, as they created self-contained and independent communities, besides a manor and/or castle. The estate had simple dwellings for the labourers, and might also include a small river or stream running through it, a church, mill, barns, and an area of woodlands. The land of the estate was divided into two main parts. The first part was the domain, which was reserved for the exclusive exploitation of the landowner. Typically, the domain was 35 to 40% of the total land on the estate. The second part was the land the labourers lived and worked on for their own daily needs, mansos. Typically around 12 acres, 5 hectares per family. The serfs on the estate farmed that land reserved for their use, as well as the domain. The The most important task of serfs was to work on the domain land of their lord for 2 or 3 days each week, and more during busy periods like harvest time. All of the food produced from that land went to the lord. It was sometimes possible for a serf to send a family member, providing they were physically able to perform the labor on the domain in their place. On the other days of the week, serfs could farm that land given to them for their own family's needs. Usually, serfs could not legally leave the estate on which they worked, but the flip side was that they also had a right to live on it, which gave them both physical protection and sustenance. A serf inherited the status of their parents. Although in the case of a mixed marriage between free and unfree laborers, the child usually inherited the status of the father if legitimate, and, if illegitimate, the status of the mother. In England and Normandy, the eldest son inherited the actual land worked on by their serf fathers, with daughters inheriting only if they had no brothers. Widows typically inherited around 1/3 of their late husband's land. In contrast, in central and southern France, Germany and Scandinavia, inheritance was equal between sons and daughters of serfs. A landowner could sell one of his serfs, but the right for sale was that of labor, not direct ownership of the person as in slavery. Theoretically, the personal property of a serf belonged to the landowner, but this was unlikely to have been enforced or had any relevance in practical terms. Aside from payment to their lord of a regular percentage of the foodstuffs produced on their own land, the peasantry had to pay a tithe to the local parish church, typically 1/10 of the peasant's harvest. The latter was used to maintain a priest, the church, and provide a small welfare fund for the poor. In addition to those two heavy costs, a serf was obliged to pay fines and certain customary fees to their lord, such as on the marriage of the lord's eldest daughter, or on the death of a serf in the form of an inheritance tax paid by the serf's heir. Fines were usually paid in kind for most of the medieval period, for example in the shape of the best animal the serf had. To protect the future generations of a landowner's serfs, there were such customs as a fine for the daughter of a serf marrying a person from outside the estate. Serfs born into a large family very often did not receive any land of their own to work, and so were obliged to continue to live in the home of their parents, marry another serf with land, or live in the household of another peasant elsewhere, giving their labor as rent. Other options included negotiating a new parcel of land from the lord, working for a local clergyman, or trying their luck in a town or city where they might find unskilled employment, working for a tradesman such as a miller or a blacksmith. As customs varied from estate to estate, and over time, there were some laborers who occupied a grey area of status between the free and unfree. One such category of serf was the ministerial serf in parts of France, Germany, and the Low Countries. These serfs, still unfree in legal terms, had in practice more freedom of movement, and could own their own property and land because they were the children of serfs, who had served a lord as administrators or in some military capacity. A description from the customs of the Richard East estate in England in 1298 CE records the following daily tasks expected of a serf. He will plough and harrow at his own expense 1/4 of an acre, and throughout the year he will work every second day, either carrying or mowing or reaping or carting, or doing some other work according as the lord or his bailiff commands him, except on Saturdays and major church holidays. And at harvest time he will find 2 men to reap for 2 days for the customary additional work at his own cost, that is, 2 men on each day. And at the end of harvest time he will reap with 1 man for the whole day at his own cost. quoted in Singman 85, the Lord was not completely heartless, and did have one or two minimal obligations to observe. Himself, all the aforesaid villains, at the end of moving will have sixpence for beer and a loaf of bread apiece. And he, the Lord, must provide 3 bushels of wheat for the aforesaid bread, and each of the aforementioned mowers will have 1 small bundle of hay each evening. As much as he can mow with his scythe, men did the heavy agricultural work described above, with women also doing lighter farm work and helping out at harvest time. Throughout the year, women had their own extensive traditional duties, such as milking, making butter and cheese, brewing ale brewed from malted grains, baking bread, tending fruit trees, cooking in general, making wool and producing wool and linen cloth, looking after poultry, household cleaning, and probably looking after any children. Serfs typically lived in a modest 1-story building made of cheap and easily acquired materials like mud and timber for the walls and thatch for the roof. There a small family unit dwelt. Retired elders usually had their own cottage. More welcome than the in-laws, a dog and cat often proved useful, the former for herding and the latter for keeping down the number of rats in the granary. There was, typically, a hearth fire in the center of the home which, besides a lot of smoke, provided warmth and light, as did candles. The windows of these simple dwellings had no glass, but were closed at night using wooden shutters, and bedding was made of straw and woolen blankets. Farm animals were kept in a separate or attached building, while a more prosperous serf family might also have a building for brewing beer and baking. A toilet was usually nothing grander than a hole over a cesspit, sometimes within a small shed, for privacy, but certainly not always. These domestic buildings were typically arranged around a courtyard to provide some protection from the wind. Food and leisure. Typical peasant food consisted of coarse bread made from wheat and rye or barley, and rye, porridge made from barley or rye, and thick soup made from any of the following cereals: peas, cabbage, leeks, spinach, onions, beans, parsley, and garlic. The better-off peasants had milk, cheese, and eggs, and meat was another rare luxury, as farm animals were much more valuable alive, the most common meat being salted pork or bacon. Dried and salted fish and eels were available at a price. Fruit, usually cooked, included apples, pears, and cherries, and wild berries and nuts were collected, too. The main drinks were weak ale or water with honey added. Few peasants would have had access to all the food just listed, and most had diets lacking in fats, proteins, calcium, and vitamins A, C, and D. A. Serf had leisure time on Sundays and on holidays, when the most popular pastimes were drinking beer, singing, and group dancing to music from pipes, flutes, and drums. There were games like dice, board games, and sports such as hockey and medieval football, where the goal was to move the ball to a predetermined destination, and there were few, if any, rules. Serfs did get to live it up a little once a year when, by tradition, they were invited to the manor on Christmas Day for a meal. Unfortunately, they had to bring along their own plates and firewood, and of course, all the food had been produced by themselves anyway. But they did get free beer, and it was at least a chance to see how the other half lived and relieved the dreariness of a country. Winter Manor Courts. The manor had its own court run by the lord or his steward, which was held a few times each year. In England, such a court, held in the great hall of a castle or manor, was known as a hall-mote or halli-mote. Disputes between members of the manor estate, such as the right to use particular areas of land like woodlands or peatlands, but not disputes between the lord and an individual peasant, were dealt with here. as well as the fines imposed on the estate workers and any criminal matters. Serious crimes such as murder, rape, and arson were judged in the courts of the crown. The Hallmote may have been biased toward the landowner, but he was usually bound by the customs established by his predecessors, and the ultimate decision of the court was actually in the hands of a jury. A panel of selected locals, usually fellow estate workers. This panel, typically consisting of 12 men, had evolved from the original jury of the early medieval period, which referred to the men called by a defendant as character witnesses. There were also higher courts to appeal to, and records show that the peasantry, acting collectively, could bring cases against a landowner. Decline of serfdom. The institution of serfdom was gradually weakened by several developments in the late Middle Ages. The sudden population declines caused by wars and plagues, particularly the Black Death, which peaked between 1347 to 1352 CE, meant that labor was in short supply and thus expensive. Another trend was for free laborers to leave the countryside and seek their fortunes in the growing number of towns and cities. Runaway serfs could similarly try their luck, and there was even a custom that by living for 1 year and a day in a town, a serf earned his freedom without sufficient labor. Many estates were abandoned. This situation gave serfs leverage to negotiate a better deal for themselves, even to receive a payment for their work. The greater use of coinage in medieval society helped make this possible and worthwhile. With saved-up money, serfs could make a payment to their lord instead of labor in some cases, or pay a fee to be absolved from some of the labor expected of them, or they could even buy their freedom. Serfs increased their political power by acting collectively in village communities, which began to hold their own courts, and which acted as a counterweight to those of the landed gentry. Finally, there were sometimes serious revolts by the peasantry against their masters. The years 1227 CE in the northern Low Countries, 1230 CE on the Lower Weser in northern Germany, and 1315 CE in the Swiss Alps, all witnessed violent peasant armies getting the better of those involving aristocratic knights. A major but unsuccessful peasant revolt, which called for the end of serfdom, occurred in England in 1381 CE across Europe. All of these factors conspired to weaken the traditional setup of unfree laborers being tied to the land and working for the rich, so that by the end of the 14th century CE, more agricultural labor was done by paid workers than unpaid serfs.